The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. while I was reviewing deployment schedules in my office at Fort Meridian, my colonel's insignia gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Colonel Reeves," came the voice of General Harrison, my father's old commanding officer. "Your father just called me in a panic. He said there's been some terrible mistake with military records. Apparently, his daughter Alexandra has been listed as a colonel in the 82nd Airborne Division." I could hear the barely contained amusement in the general's voice. I told him there was no mistake. His worthless little disappointment is now one of the youngest colonels in the U.S. Army, and she's been personally recommended for the Pentagon's Strategic Command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My father didn't know that I'd been building the military career he always said I was too weak for, earning the respect he claimed I'd never deserve, and commanding the soldiers he insisted would never follow someone like me. For 23 years, he'd called me worthless, weak, and a waste of the family name. Tonight, he'd finally learned that the daughter he'd written off had become everything he'd failed to be himself. Before I tell you how we got here, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story of proving everyone wrong resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because I've got something incredible planned for next week that you won't want to miss. My name is Alexandra Catherine Reeves, and until that phone call, my father had spent 2 decades believing I was exactly what he'd always told me I was: a disappointment, a failure, and living proof that his bloodline had produced nothing of value. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves had served honorably in the Marines for 12 years before a training accident ended his career and left him bitter about everything he'd lost. What he chose to lose next was his relationship with me. Growing up in Millbrook, Tennessee, I learned early that nothing I did would ever be good enough for the man who'd once been called a hero. My straight A's were dismissed as book learning that won't help you in the real world. My athletic achievements were diminished with comments like, "Too bad you're built like your mother," instead of having real strength. When I expressed interest in following his military footsteps, he laughed until he nearly choked on his beer. "The military isn't a place for soft little girls who cry when they break a nail," he'd said when I was 16 and mentioned wanting to attend West Point. "You think you're tough because you played some high school sports? Real soldiers would eat you alive. Save everyone the embarrassment and find something more suited to your limitations." But I wasn't the fragile daughter he thought he was protecting, or the weak disappointment he'd convinced himself he'd raised. I was watching, learning, and quietly planning to prove him wrong in ways he couldn't even imagine. While he told neighbors that my daughter would probably end up working retail or maybe teaching elementary school if she was lucky, I was researching military academies, studying leadership principles, and preparing for a future that would shatter every assumption he'd made about my potential. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the man who'd spent years telling me I wasn't good enough to serve was about to discover that I'd not only served, but excelled beyond his own achievements. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, who'd never advanced beyond mid-level enlisted ranks, was going to learn that his worthless daughter had earned the Silver Eagles of a full colonel. What made tonight's revelation even more perfect was how it happened. My father had been at the Millbrook VFW Hall, his usual Thursday night haunt, telling anyone who'd listen about his glory days and complaining about how kids today had no discipline or dedication. When the conversation turned to rising stars in today's military, someone mentioned seeing a news article about a young female colonel named Reeves who'd been selected for a prestigious Pentagon position. "Reeves is a common enough name," my father had reportedly said, according to what General Harrison told me later. But just to be sure it wasn't some clerical error involving my useless daughter, I should probably check. He'd somehow convinced himself that there might be administrative confusion because we shared the same last name. The idea that it might actually be me never seriously crossed his mind. So he'd called his old commanding officer, General Harrison, at nearly midnight, demanding that someone check military records to ensure his daughter's name hadn't been mistakenly linked to achievements she could never have earned. He wanted proof that the Colonel Alexander Reeves mentioned in the articles was someone else entirely, someone worthy of the rank and recognition. Instead, General Harrison confirmed his worst nightmare and my greatest triumph. Not only was I the colonel they'd been discussing, but I'd earned the rank through exceptional service, strategic brilliance, and the kind of leadership abilities my father had spent years insisting I'd never possess. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, who'd never advanced beyond mid-level enlisted ranks, was going to learn that his worthless daughter had earned the Silver Eagles of a full colonel. The silence on my father's end of that phone call, as General Harrison later described it, lasted nearly 30 seconds. Then came a string of confused questions, desperate attempts to understand how his weak little girl had not only survived military life, but had thrived in ways that exceeded his own service record. "She's commanded respect from some of the toughest soldiers in the Army," General Harrison had told him. "The same soldiers you said would never follow someone like her. She's been personally commended by the Secretary of Defense. The same leadership skills you said she'd never develop have made her one of the most promising officers of her generation." As I sat in my office that night, still processing the conversation with General Harrison, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because every cruel word my father had spoken about my limitations had been proven spectacularly wrong. Sadness because it had taken a phone call from his former superior officer to make him realize that the daughter he'd dismissed might actually be worth knowing. The journey from that 16-year-old girl he'd laughed at to the colonel he couldn't believe existed had been deliberate, strategic, and fueled by every dismissive comment he'd ever made. What he'd intended as discouragement had become my motivation. What he'd meant as protection from disappointment had become my determination to exceed every expectation. Tonight, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves was learning that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who surprise you in ways you never thought possible, and his worthless daughter was about to teach him the most important lesson of his life: that strength isn't always what you expect it to look like, and sometimes the greatest victories come from proving wrong the people who should have believed in you from the beginning. But this story really begins 5 years earlier, when I made a decision that would change everything. Let me take you back to where it all started. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment that changed everything happened on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in March, 5 years before that phone call would shatter my father's assumptions. I was 21, home from my junior year at Nashville State University, where I was studying business administration because it was practical and something a girl could handle, according to my father. I had been quietly researching military officer programs for months, but hadn't found the courage to mention it at home. That evening, my father was holding court in our small living room, entertaining his drinking buddy Mike Patterson with stories from his Marine days. Empty beer bottles lined the coffee table, and the familiar smell of stale alcohol and disappointment hung in the air like it always did when Dad started reminiscing about the glory days that had ended 15 years earlier. "You know what's wrong with kids today?" Dad was saying, his voice already slurred from his fourth beer. "No backbone, no discipline. They think the world owes them something just for showing up. Take Alex here. 21 years old and still has no idea what she wants to do with her life. Probably end up married to some loser and popping out babies before she's 25. Mike chuckled, but there was discomfort in his laugh. Even he seemed to recognize that my father's comments had crossed from general complaints into personal cruelty. "Come on, Danny. Alex is a smart girl. She'll figure it out." "Smart?" My father snorted. "Book smart, maybe, but that's not the same as real intelligence. Real intelligence is knowing your limitations and not reaching for things you'll never achieve." He gestured in my direction with his beer bottle. "She's got these crazy ideas about joining the military. Can you imagine? This soft little thing thinking she could survive basic training?" The words hit me like a physical blow, but what hurt more was the realization that he'd known about my research all along.
Somehow he'd discovered my interest in military service and had been waiting for the right moment to humiliate me with the knowledge he possessed. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. I never said anything about joining the military. I managed to say, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. "You didn't have to say anything," Dad replied, his tone turning cruel with the satisfaction of someone who'd caught their prey. "I saw the West Point pamphlets hidden in your room, the online searches on my computer that you thought I wouldn't notice, ROTC information requests." He shook his head in disgust. "The military isn't a social experiment, Alex. It's not a place where you get participation trophies for trying your best. Real soldiers die when weak links break under pressure." Mike shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Maybe she's tougher than you think, Danny." "Tougher?" My father's laugh was harsh and bitter.
The room fell silent, except for the rain pattering against the windows. I stood frozen in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, feeling exposed and humiliated. Every secret dream I'd harbored about proving myself, about serving my country, about earning respect through merit rather than birthright, was being dissected and dismissed by the man whose approval I'd spent years desperately seeking. "The truth is," my father continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used when he wanted to drive a point home, "some people are built for greatness, and some people are built for ordinary lives. There's no shame in being ordinary, as long as you accept it and don't waste everyone's time pretending to be something you're not." He looked directly at me, his eyes cold and dismissive. "You're not built for the military, Alex. You're not built for leadership. You're not built for anything that requires real strength or courage. The sooner you accept that and find something more suited to your abilities, the happier everyone will be." Mike Patterson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I should probably head home. Jennifer is expecting me for dinner." He stood quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. As he gathered his jacket, he caught my eye and gave me a small, apologetic shrug. After Mike left, the house fell into an oppressive silence. My father returned to his beer, apparently satisfied that he delivered an important life lesson. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. For years, I had been trying to earn his respect through achievements he deemed acceptable. Good grades in safe subjects, part-time jobs that demonstrated responsibility without threatening his worldview, relationships with boys he approved of because they posed no challenge to his authority. I had been living my life in the margins of his expectations, always careful not to reach too high or dream too boldly. But in that moment, listening to him categorically dismiss not just my dreams, but my fundamental worth as a human being, something crystallized in my mind. His approval wasn't worth having if it required me to accept limitations that weren't real. His respect wasn't worth earning if it could only be gained by making myself smaller than I actually was. "You're wrong," I said quietly, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. My father looked up from his beer, eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. In 21 years, I had never directly contradicted him. I had disagreed silently, complied reluctantly, and rebelled passive-aggressively. But I had never looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone carrying a warning that I was approaching dangerous territory. "You're wrong about me," I repeated, my voice gaining strength. "You're wrong about what I'm capable of, what I'm built for, and what I can achieve. And I'm going to prove it." His face darkened. "Oh, you're gonna prove it. And how exactly do you plan to do that?" I took a deep breath, knowing that the words I was about to speak would change everything between us, probably forever. "I'm going to join the Army. I'm going to become an officer, and I'm going to succeed in ways that will make your service record look like a practice run." The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. Not the bitter, dismissive laugh from earlier, but genuine amusement, as if I just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard.
The Army? He gasped between laughs. You're going to join the Army? Oh, Alex, that's rich. That's really rich. You can't even kill a spider without calling for help, and you think you're going to be a soldier? He wiped tears from his eyes, still chuckling. Go ahead, sweetheart. Give it a try. Basic training will sort you out real quick. You'll be home crying to mama within a week, begging me to help you figure out how to get discharged for psychological reasons or some other face-saving excuse. He stood up, steadying himself against the arm of the couch. But hey, maybe this is exactly what you need. A good dose of reality. Let the Army show you what I've been trying to tell you for years. That wanting something doesn't make you capable of achieving it. As he walked past me toward the stairs, he paused. Just remember, when you wash out, and you will wash out, I tried to save you from this embarrassment. I tried to help you understand your limitations before you humiliated yourself in front of people who matter. Don't come crying to me when the real world teaches you lessons I've been trying to spare you from. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the college textbooks and career guidance pamphlets that now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I wasn't just going to join the Army to prove my father wrong, though that was certainly part of it. I was going to excel in ways that would force him to confront every assumption he'd made about strength, leadership, and what it meant to serve with honor.
I opened my laptop and began researching Officer Candidate School, mentally preparing for a journey that would take me far from the small-minded limitations of my father's expectations and toward a destiny he couldn't even imagine. The girl he'd called worthless was about to become someone he'd never expected, and by the time he realized his mistake, it would be too late to take back years of cruel dismissals and crushing discouragement. The war between us had officially begun, and I intended to win it decisively. The investigation phase of my plan began at 6 a.m. the next morning, while my father slept off his hangover and the echoes of his cruel laughter still rang in my ears. I had always been methodical, a trait he'd dismissed as overthinking, but now I channeled that analytical nature into researching every aspect of military service with the precision of someone preparing for the most important exam of their life. My first stop was the campus library at Nashville State, where I claimed a corner table in the military history section and began what would become months of intensive research. I wasn't just looking at recruitment materials anymore. I was studying the psychological profiles of successful officers, analyzing leadership case studies, and examining the career trajectories of women who had broken barriers in traditionally male-dominated military roles. I discovered that my father's dismissive comments about weak links and participation trophies revealed more about his own limitations than mine. The modern military, I learned, valued emotional intelligence alongside physical strength, strategic thinking as much as tactical prowess, and collaborative leadership over authoritarian command styles. Everything he'd criticized about my personality, my tendency to listen before speaking, my preference for building consensus rather than demanding compliance, my ability to remain calm under pressure, were actually assets in contemporary military leadership. But I knew that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. If I was going to succeed where my father expected me to fail, I needed to address every possible weakness he might exploit to justify his predictions. I created what I privately called Operation Prove Them Wrong, a comprehensive preparation strategy that would transform me into someone he couldn't dismiss. Physical fitness became my first priority. While I'd been reasonably athletic in high school, playing soccer and running track, I knew military standards would be far more demanding. I researched Army physical fitness test requirements and discovered that I needed to dramatically improve my upper body strength and cardiovascular endurance. Every morning at 5 a.m. before my father woke up from his hangover and began a training regimen that included running,
push-ups, sit-ups, and weight training at the university gym. The early morning runs through Millbrook's quiet streets became my meditation time, where I processed my father's criticisms and transformed them into fuel for my determination. Every step was a rejection of his limitations, every mile a declaration that I was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. When neighbors occasionally saw me running before dawn, I could sense their curiosity, but I wasn't ready to explain my plans to anyone yet. This preparation phase was mine alone. Mental preparation proved equally crucial. I began reading memoirs of military leaders, studying their decision-making processes during crisis situations, and analyzing how they'd overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. I was particularly drawn to stories of leaders who had been underestimated early in their careers, but had proven their worth through consistent excellence rather than dramatic gestures. One book that profoundly influenced my thinking was Leadership in Combat by retired General Patricia Morrison, who had faced similar dismissals from male colleagues who questioned whether women possessed the psychological fortitude for military leadership. Her approach to proving critics wrong wasn't through confrontation or defensiveness, but methodical competence that made their objections irrelevant. Don't argue with people who doubt your capabilities. Demonstrate your worth so clearly that their doubts become embarrassing to maintain. I photocopied that quote and taped it to my bathroom mirror, where I'd see it every morning as I prepared for another day of training and preparation. It became my operational philosophy. Let results speak louder than arguments. Financial planning became another crucial element of my preparation. Military service would mean giving up my part-time job at the campus bookstore and potentially extending my education timeline. I researched military education benefits, calculated living expenses during training periods, and developed a budget that would sustain me through the transition. I opened a separate savings account that my father couldn't access and began depositing every spare dollar, money I earned from tutoring fellow students in business courses. My research revealed that officer candidate school would be the most direct path to the leadership role I envisioned. Unlike enlisting as a private and working my way up through the ranks, which would take years and might validate my father's expectations about starting at the bottom where I belonged, OCS would put me on an accelerated track to becoming a commissioned officer. The application process itself was rigorous, requiring letters of recommendation, physical fitness qualifications, psychological evaluations, and extensive background checks. I began cultivating relationships with professors who could speak to my leadership potential, volunteering for positions that would demonstrate my ability to manage responsibility under pressure.
Dr. Sarah Kellerman, my strategic management professor, became an unexpected ally in this process. During office hours one afternoon, I mentioned my interest in military leadership, and she shared that her brother had been a career Navy officer. She understood the unique challenges facing women in military service and offered to help me prepare for the psychological evaluation component of the OCS application. The evaluators will be looking for emotional stability, decision-making ability under stress, and leadership potential, she explained. They're not interested in people who are fearless. Fear is healthy and appropriate in dangerous situations. They want people who can function effectively despite fear, who can make sound decisions when the stakes are high, and who can inspire others to follow them into difficult circumstances. She arranged for me to participate in leadership simulations with graduate students in the business program, exercises that put me in positions where I had to make quick decisions with incomplete information while managing conflicting personalities and competing priorities. These sessions were invaluable preparation for what I'd face in OCS, but they also revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. During one particularly challenging simulation involving a crisis management scenario, I found myself naturally taking charge of a group that included several older students who initially questioned my authority. By the end of the exercise, they were looking to me for direction, and the graduate student facilitating the session noted that I demonstrated
natural command presence, and an ability to maintain calm authority under pressure. These experiences began to reshape my self-perception in ways that contradicted everything my father had told me about my limitations. I wasn't the fragile, emotional weakling he had described. Under pressure, I became more focused, not less. When faced with challenges, I became strategic, not panicked. When required to lead, I found reserves of confidence I hadn't known existed. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of my preparation was learning to document everything. I kept detailed records of my physical training progress, noting improvements in strength, endurance, and overall fitness. I maintained files of academic achievements, leadership experiences, and community service activities that would strengthen my OCS application. I researched the backgrounds of successful female military officers and identified mentors I hoped to connect with once I began my service. This documentation served a dual purpose. It provided concrete evidence of my commitment and preparation that could counter any future criticism from my father, and it helped me track my own progress toward becoming the person I needed to be for military success. 3 months into this preparation phase, I had a chance encounter that would prove pivotal to my journey. While running my usual early morning route through downtown Millbrook, I met Captain Jennifer Hayes, who was home on leave visiting her family. She was also an early morning runner, and we began encountering each other regularly on the quiet streets. Captain Hayes was everything I hoped to become. Confident without arrogance, strong without sacrificing femininity, respected for her competence rather than tolerated for her compliance. She'd graduated from OCS 5 years earlier and was currently serving as a logistics officer at Fort Campbell, managing supply operations for an entire battalion. During our running conversations, she shared insights about military life that no recruitment brochure could provide. She described the challenges of earning respect in a male-dominated environment, the importance of developing thick skin without losing empathy, and the satisfaction of proving critics wrong through consistent excellence rather than dramatic confrontation. The hardest part isn't the physical demands or even the psychological pressure, she told me during one of our longer runs. It's learning to trust your own judgment when everyone around you is waiting for you to fail. Some people will doubt you because you're young, some because you're female, and some because they project their own insecurities onto your potential success. Her words resonated deeply because they perfectly described my situation with my father. His doubts about my capabilities weren't really about me. They were about his own fears of being overshadowed by someone he'd always seen as lesser than himself. By the time spring semester ended, I had transformed myself in ways that went far beyond physical fitness or academic preparation. I had developed an unshakable confidence in my ability to succeed at whatever I set my mind to, backed by months of evidence that contradicted every limitation my father had tried to impose on my aspirations. The girl who had been humiliated in her own living room 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place was a young woman who understood her own strength, had tested her capabilities under pressure, and possessed a clear vision of the future she intended to create. But I wasn't ready to reveal my progress yet. The element of surprise would be crucial to the impact I hoped to make. Let my father continue believing I was the weak, directionless disappointment he had described to his drinking buddy. When the time came to reveal my transformation, the contrast would be all the more dramatic.
The awakening came during a sweltering July evening 6 months into my transformation, as I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by military leadership manuals and OCS application materials. The contrast between who I was becoming and who I had been was so stark that I barely recognized the girl who had once sought my father's approval above all else. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand the deeper patterns that had shaped our relationship and how my own behavior had enabled his dismissive treatment. For 21 years, I had been complicit in my own diminishment. Not because I was weak or worthless, as my father claimed, but because I had accepted a role in our family dynamic that required me to be smaller than I actually was.
I had been the accommodating daughter, the one who absorbed his disappointments and frustrations without pushing back, who made herself convenient and undemanding so as not to threaten his position as the family's sole source of strength and authority. Looking back through this new lens of self-awareness, I could see how I had unconsciously reinforced every negative assumption he'd made about my capabilities. When he criticized my emotions, I had learned to suppress them rather than defending their validity. When he dismissed my achievements, I had minimized them myself rather than insisting on their value. When he questioned my judgment, I had deferred to his rather than trusting my own instincts. This pattern had become so ingrained that I barely noticed it happening. I had developed what psychologists call learned helplessness, but in my case, it was learned smallness. I had trained myself to occupy less space, demand less attention, and expect less respect than I deserved. My father hadn't created this dynamic alone. I had been an active participant in my own marginalization. The revelation was both liberating and infuriating. Liberating because it meant the limitations weren't real. They were learned behaviors that could be unlearned. Infuriating because I realized how much of my potential I had sacrificed to maintain a peace that was never really peaceful, just quietly oppressive. I began to examine specific memories through this new understanding, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. When I had won the state championship in debate during my senior year of high school, my father's response was, "Don't let it go to your head. Talking isn't the same as doing." Instead of celebrating this achievement that demonstrated analytical thinking, quick reasoning, and the ability to perform under pressure, all qualities essential for military leadership, I had accepted his dismissal and downplayed the victory when telling others about it. When I had been elected student body treasurer at Nashville State, managing a budget of over $50,000 and implementing new financial oversight procedures that caught several instances of mismanagement, my father had commented, "Treasurer is basically a secretary job with math. Real leadership means making decisions that affect people's lives." Again, instead of recognizing this as evidence of my organizational skills, financial acumen, and ability to handle responsibility, I had internalized his belittlement and began describing the position to others as just some administrative stuff. Even my academic achievements had been systematically diminished through this pattern. My 3.8 GPA in a demanding business program became book learning that doesn't translate to real-world success. My part-time job managing the campus bookstore's inventory and training new employees became retail work that any high school dropout could handle. My volunteer work coordinating disaster relief efforts for tornado victims in neighboring counties became playing social worker instead of developing practical skills. Each dismissal had trained me to see my own accomplishments through his minimizing lens, to anticipate criticism rather than expect recognition, and to preemptively diminish myself before others could do it for me. I had become my father's most effective critic, doing his work of keeping me small even when he wasn't around. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of this dynamic was how it had affected my relationship with other people. I had learned to make myself agreeable rather than authentic, accommodating rather than assertive, helpful rather than leading. I sought approval rather than respect, tried to be liked rather than valued for my capabilities. This approach had worked in environments where conflict avoidance was rewarded, but it would be disastrous in military settings where decisiveness and confidence were essential for effective leadership. Captain Hayes had observed this tendency during one of our morning runs when I mentioned my concerns about commanding respect from soldiers who might initially question my authority. She had said, "You're still thinking like someone who needs permission to lead. Authority isn't something other people give you, it's something you claim through competence and confidence. If you're waiting for them to decide you're worthy of respect, you'll be waiting forever." Her observation stung because it was accurate. Even as I prepared for military service, I was still mentally seeking validation rather than simply expecting it as my due. I was still operating from the assumption that I needed to prove my worth rather than from the understanding that my worth was inherent and my job was simply to demonstrate how that worth translated into effective leadership.
This realization led me to examine my father's own story with new understanding. His bitterness about his truncated military career, his need to diminish others to feel important, his inability to celebrate achievements that reminded him of his own limitations. These weren't signs of strength, but of deep insecurity. He needed me to be small, not because I actually was small, but because my growth threatened his self-image as the family's sole source of accomplishment and wisdom. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves had reached the peak of his potential in the military and had been forced to leave service due to circumstances beyond his control. Rather than finding new sources of meaning and achievement, he had spent 15 years reliving his glory days and ensuring that no one around him, especially his daughter, achieved heights that would eclipse his own limited success. Understanding this dynamic didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained it in ways that removed the personal sting from his criticisms. His assessment of my limitations wasn't based on accurate observation of my capabilities. It was based on his psychological need to maintain his position as the family's alpha achievement. My success in areas he valued, leadership, military service, command respect, represented an existential threat to the identity he had constructed around being the only real warrior in the family. This understanding fundamentally changed my motivation for pursuing military service. Initially, I had been driven primarily by a desire to prove my father wrong, to force him to acknowledge that his assessment of my capabilities was incorrect. While that remained a satisfying secondary goal, my primary motivation evolved into something more personally meaningful: the desire to become fully myself without apology or accommodation to others' limitations. I wanted to discover what I was actually capable of when I stopped making myself smaller to fit other people's comfort zones. I wanted to test my abilities in environments that rewarded excellence rather than compliance, where my value would be measured by my contributions rather than my willingness to avoid threatening anyone's ego. I wanted to serve in a context where strength was appreciated rather than criticized, where leadership was cultivated rather than discouraged. Most importantly, I wanted to break the cycle of learned smallness that could potentially affect future generations. If I had daughters someday, I wanted them to see a mother who had claimed her full potential, rather than one who had settled for a diminished version of herself. If I had sons, I wanted them to respect women as equals, rather than learning to view female achievement as threatening to their own worth. The military would be my laboratory for this transformation, the proving ground where I would discover who Alexandra Reeves actually was when freed from the constraints of others' expectations and limitations. Not the accommodating daughter who sought approval above all else, not the diminished version of myself that my father found comfortable, but the full expression of my capabilities in service to something larger than family dynamics or personal validation. By the end of that July evening, I had made a decision that went beyond simply joining the Army to prove my father wrong. I was going to reclaim every aspect of myself that I had minimized, suppressed, or diminished over the years. I was going to become someone who commanded respect not by demanding it, but by earning it through consistent excellence and unshakable confidence in my own worth. The girl who had once made herself small to keep peace in her family was about to become a woman who would never again apologize for being exactly as capable, intelligent, and strong as she actually was. And that transformation would ultimately prove more powerful than any single achievement or rank I might earn, because it would be the foundation upon which all future success would be built. August marked the beginning of my strategic assembly phase, where I began building the team and resources necessary to ensure my military aspirations would succeed beyond anyone's expectations. This wasn't simply about meeting minimum requirements for officer candidate school. I was preparing to excel in ways that would make my eventual achievements impossible to dismiss or minimize. My first crucial alliance came through Dr. Kellerman, who introduced me to retired Colonel Robert Chen, a decorated veteran who had transitioned into civilian life as a leadership consultant for Fortune 500 companies. Colonel Chen had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, earning a Bronze Star for valor and building a reputation as one of the Army's most effective company commanders before retiring to care for his aging parents.
Sarah tells me you're serious about OCS, Colonel Chen said during our first meeting at a coffee shop near the university. His presence was commanding, even in civilian clothes, the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively straighten their posture when he entered the room. I had prepared for this conversation carefully, knowing that Colonel Chen's assessment could significantly impact my trajectory. Rather than dwelling on my father's dismissals, I focused on demonstrating the analytical thinking and strategic planning that would serve me well as an officer.
I've identified several areas where I need to develop beyond standard OCS preparation, I explained, pulling out a folder containing my detailed preparation plan. Physical fitness is progressing ahead of schedule, but I want to understand leadership dynamics that aren't covered in textbooks. I need mentorship from someone who's actually commanded soldiers in combat situations. Colonel Chen reviewed my training logs, academic records, and leadership experience portfolio with the same attention he might have given to intelligence briefings. After 20 minutes of careful examination, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. This level of preparation is unusual for someone who hasn't even applied to OCS yet, he observed. Most candidates show up hoping their enthusiasm will carry them through. You're approaching this like a military operation. Because it is a military operation, I replied without hesitation. My objective is to become an officer who earns respect through competence, not someone who barely meets minimum standards and spends their career proving they deserve to be there. That answer seemed to satisfy something in Colonel Chen's assessment. He agreed to mentor me through the OCS application process and provide advanced leadership training that would give me advantages most candidates wouldn't possess. Our first session was scheduled for the following week at his private training facility outside Nashville. Simultaneously, I began building other crucial relationships that would support my transformation. Through Captain Hayes, I connected with Lieutenant Maria Santos, a West Point graduate currently stationed at Fort Benning, who specialized in military logistics and strategic planning. Lieutenant Santos agreed to provide insights into the political dynamics of military service that would help me navigate potential challenges as a female officer in leadership positions. The biggest mistake young female officers make is trying to prove they're one of the guys, Lieutenant Santos explained during our first video call. They think that by minimizing their femininity or adopting hyper-aggressive leadership styles, they'll earn respect faster. Actually, the most successful female officers I know are completely comfortable with who they are and focus on being exceptional at their jobs rather than performing some version of masculinity. Her guidance proved invaluable as I developed my own leadership philosophy. Rather than trying to emulate male authority figures or apologizing for my gender, I would focus on developing my natural strengths: emotional intelligence, collaborative problem-solving, and the ability to remain calm under pressure while maintaining clear strategic thinking. The third crucial element of my team was Master Sergeant Linda Rodriguez, a career soldier with 22 years of experience who ran a private fitness training program for prospective military candidates. While I had made significant progress in physical conditioning on my own, Master Sergeant Rodriguez would ensure I exceeded rather than merely met military fitness standards. Physical training isn't just about meeting requirements, she explained during my initial assessment at her gym. It's about building the kind of mental toughness that shows in everything you do. When soldiers see that their officer is in better shape than they are, it automatically establishes respect that you'd otherwise have to earn through other means. Her training regimen was brutal, but precisely calibrated to my goals. Instead of general fitness, we focused on building the specific types of strength and endurance that would serve me well in military contexts: functional movement patterns, obstacle course navigation, tactical fitness scenarios, and the kind of cardiovascular endurance that would allow me to think clearly even when physically exhausted. But perhaps the most important discovery during this team-building phase was my own capacity for inspiring others to invest in my success.
Each of these experienced military professionals was choosing to spend significant time and energy helping me achieve my goals, not because they owed me anything, but because they believed in my potential and wanted to see me succeed. This realization contradicted everything my father had suggested about my inability to earn respect or inspire confidence in others. Here were people who had commanded respect in the most demanding circumstances, and they were voluntarily committing to my development because they saw qualities in me that my father either had missed or chosen to ignore. Colonel Chen became particularly invested in my preparation after our third mentoring session, where we worked through a complex leadership scenario involving a simulated combat situation with multiple casualties and conflicting priorities. My approach to the problem, calm analysis, clear communication of priorities, delegation based on individual strengths, and decisive action when consensus wasn't possible, impressed him enough that he made an extraordinary offer. I'm going to write a letter of recommendation for your OCS application, but more than that, I'm going to make some calls to colleagues who are currently serving in leadership positions. When you graduate from OCS, you'll have opportunities for assignments that most new officers never see. This level of support felt thrilling and overwhelming. I was beginning to understand that success in the military, like success in most fields, depended significantly on relationships and reputation. The network I was building now would influence not just my acceptance into OCS, but my entire career trajectory afterward.
Meanwhile, I maintained absolute secrecy about these preparations from my family. As far as my father knew, I was still the directionless college student working at the campus bookstore and showing no signs of the focus or determination he claimed I lacked. I continued living at home to save money for my military transition, but I scheduled all my training sessions and mentoring meetings during times when he was at work or otherwise occupied. This double life became increasingly surreal as the contrast between my external presentation and internal development grew more pronounced. At home, I remained the accommodating daughter who avoided conflict and asked permission before making minor decisions. But in my military preparation contexts, I was becoming someone who commanded rooms, made strategic decisions with confidence, and inspired respected veterans to invest in my future. The psychological challenge of maintaining this duality was exhausting but necessary. I needed to preserve the element of surprise that would make my eventual announcement maximally impactful. If my father suspected the extent of my preparation and development, he might find ways to undermine my confidence or create obstacles that would be harder to overcome. By September, my preparation team had helped me identify and develop capabilities that went far beyond what I had imagined possible when I first decided to pursue military service. I wasn't just preparing to survive OCS. I was preparing to excel in ways that would fast-track my career and position me for leadership roles that typically took years to achieve. Colonel Chen had introduced me to advanced tactical thinking concepts usually reserved for senior officers. Lieutenant Santos had taught me to navigate military bureaucracy and politics with the skill of someone who had learned these lessons through years of service. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had transformed my physical capabilities to levels that exceeded many active duty soldiers. But perhaps most importantly, these relationships had fundamentally changed my self-perception. I was no longer the girl seeking approval from authority figures. I had become someone whose potential was recognized and actively supported by people whose opinions carried real weight in the military community. The transformation my father had declared impossible was not only happening, but was being validated by the very people he most respected, career military professionals who had proven themselves in the crucible of actual service. When the time came to reveal my plans, I would have more than personal determination. I would have the backing of a network that could vouch for my readiness and potential in ways that would be impossible for him to dismiss. The strategic phase of my preparation was complete. Now it was time to execute the plan that would transform me from his worthless disappointment into someone he would have no choice but to respect. October brought the moment I had been carefully orchestrating for months, the perfect setup for my grand revelation.
I had completed my OCS application with letters of recommendation that Colonel Chen described as the strongest package I've seen in 15 years of evaluating candidates. My physical fitness scores were in the top 5% of all applicants. My psychological evaluation had identified me as possessing exceptional leadership potential and emotional resilience under pressure. All that remained was choosing the optimal moment and method for announcing my plans to my family. The opportunity presented itself during the annual Millbrook Veterans Day celebration, an event that my father attended religiously and treated as his personal stage for reliving his military glory. For the past decade, he had served as the master of ceremonies, introducing speakers and sharing stories about his own service that grew more embellished each year. This year's celebration would be held at the high school auditorium with the entire town expected to attend. 3 days before the event, I received the phone call that would make my announcement even more dramatic than I had originally planned. Colonel Chen's voice carried barely contained excitement as he delivered news that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Alexandra, I just got off the phone with Brigadier General Patricia Hutchinson at Fort Benning. She's reviewed your application package and wants to fast-track you through an accelerated OCS program. If you accept, you'll start training in January, complete the program in 12 weeks instead of the standard 16, and graduate with automatic consideration for advanced leadership positions. The accelerated program was typically reserved for candidates with prior military experience or exceptional qualifications that indicated they could handle compressed training without compromising standards. Only 10 slots were available each year, and competition was fierce among candidates who had already proven themselves in various military contexts. There's more, Colonel Chen continued. General Hutchinson specifically mentioned that your preparation level and the strength of your recommendations suggest you have the potential for rapid advancement. She's already indicated that upon graduation, you'd be considered for assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, working directly under some of the Army's most respected commanders. I sat in my car outside the campus library, processing the magnitude of what he was telling me. The 82nd Airborne was one of the Army's most elite units, known for producing officers who went on to the highest levels of military leadership. Assignment there as a brand new second lieutenant was virtually unheard of unless you had demonstrated exceptional potential during training.
Sir, I need to ask, did you mention my family situation when you spoke with General Hutchinson? Colonel Chen chuckled. I may have indicated that you were motivated by some people who had underestimated your potential. The general found that interesting. She said some of the best officers she's known were driven by the desire to prove critics wrong, as long as that motivation evolved into genuine commitment to service. This was beyond anything I had dared to hope for. Not only would I be proving my father wrong about my military potential, but I would be doing so in ways that surpassed his own service record so dramatically that comparison would become impossible. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves would have to confront the reality that his worthless daughter had achieved in months what he had never accomplished in 12 years of service. I spent the next 3 days preparing for what I privately called Operation Shock and Awe. The Veterans Day celebration would provide the perfect audience and context for my announcement. My father would be surrounded by fellow veterans and community members who respected military service, making it impossible for him to dismiss or belittle my achievements without looking foolish in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. The morning of the celebration, I dressed carefully in my best business attire, knowing that appearance would matter for the impression I wanted to create. I had prepared my announcement with the same strategic precision I'd applied to every other aspect of my military preparation, anticipating potential responses and planning my reactions accordingly. The auditorium was packed with families, veterans, and community leaders. My father took the stage in his dress uniform from his Marine days, which still fit thanks to his disciplined fitness routine, one of the few aspects of his military service that he had maintained over the years. He looked every inch the proud veteran as he introduced various speakers and shared carefully selected anecdotes about military brotherhood and service to country.
I waded through the preliminary presentations, local politicians thanking veterans for their service, and the high school band performing patriotic songs. My moment would come during the open microphone session, when community members were invited to share their own military stories or express gratitude to veterans and their families. When my father announced the open microphone portion, several elderly veterans shared brief stories about their service in Korea and Vietnam. A young woman thanked her brother who was currently deployed in Afghanistan. A father spoke about his son who had recently completed basic training and was preparing for his first assignment. Then, I stood up and walked toward the stage. My father's expression shifted from his practiced ceremonial smile to confusion as he recognized me approaching the microphone. The audience, mostly familiar with our family, seemed equally puzzled about what his daughter might have to contribute to a veterans celebration. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. "My name is Alexandra Reeves, and I'm here tonight to make an announcement that I hope will inspire other young people in our community to consider military service." I paused, making eye contact with my father, who was standing frozen beside the podium. His face had gone pale as he began to suspect where this was heading. 3 weeks ago, I was accepted into the United States Army Officer Candidate School. I'll be starting the accelerated program in January, and upon graduation, I'll be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division. The auditorium erupted in applause, but I kept my eyes on my father, watching as the full implications of my announcement hit him. This wasn't just about joining the military. This was about achieving at levels that he had never reached, being selected for opportunities that had never been offered to him, and doing it all while he had been dismissing my potential. "I want to thank several people who have supported my preparation," I continued as the applause died down. "Colonel Robert Chen, who provided mentorship that helped me understand what it truly means to lead soldiers. Lieutenant Maria Santos, who taught me about the honor and responsibility of military service. And Master Sergeant Linda Rodriguez, who helped me develop the physical and mental toughness that military leadership requires." Each name I mentioned carried weight in the local military community. Colonel Chen was well known for his decorated service and selective mentorship. The fact that these respected figures had invested in my development spoke volumes about my potential in ways that transcended anything my father might say to diminish the announcement. I also want to acknowledge my father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves. His years of military service taught me about the importance of discipline, dedication, and serving something larger than yourself. I hope to honor the family tradition while forging my own path in the Army.
This was the moment I had crafted most carefully. Rather than publicly confronting his dismissals or expressing resentment about his lack of support, I was taking the high road while subtly highlighting that I was about to surpass his achievements. The audience heard gratitude and respect. My father heard the implicit comparison between his abbreviated enlisted career and my officer track appointment to an elite unit. The applause was thunderous, and people began standing throughout the auditorium. Veterans who had served with my father approached the stage to congratulate both of us, creating a receiving line that forced him to stand beside me while accepting praise for raising such an accomplished daughter. "Danny, you never mentioned that Alex was interested in military service," said retired Colonel James Mitchell, who had served with my father during his early years in the Marines. "Officer Candidate School and the 82nd Airborne? That's incredibly impressive for someone her age." My father managed to produce appropriate responses, but I could see the shock and confusion in his eyes. Everything he thought he knew about me, every assumption he had made about my capabilities, was being challenged in the most public way possible. The daughter he had called worthless was being celebrated by the very community whose respect he valued most. As the evening concluded and people began filtering out of the auditorium, my father finally approached me directly.
His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, and for the first time in my memory, he appeared uncertain about how to interact with me. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Yes," I agreed. "We do. But not tonight. Tonight, I'm going to celebrate with the people who believed in my potential, even when others didn't." I walked away then, leaving him standing alone on the stage where he had presided over countless Veterans Day celebrations, suddenly confronted with the reality that his assessment of his own daughter had been so fundamentally wrong that he would need to reconstruct his entire understanding of who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The confrontation I had orchestrated so carefully reached its crescendo 3 days after the Veterans Day celebration, when my father's carefully constructed worldview finally collapsed under the weight of evidence he could no longer ignore or dismiss. The intervening days had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare as I maintained perfect calm while he struggled to process the magnitude of his miscalculation about my capabilities. During those 3 days, our house became a battlefield of silent tension. My father attempted several times to initiate conversations about my announcement, but I deflected each attempt with polite detachment, focusing instead on my preparations for OCS and responding to the flood of congratulations from community members who had heard about my acceptance into the accelerated program. The calls and visits from local veterans created a constant reminder of his failure to recognize my potential. Former Marines who had served with him stopped by to congratulate our family, invariably expressing amazement that he had raised such an accomplished daughter while somehow never mentioning her military aspirations. Each conversation forced him to confront the reality that everyone else seemed to see qualities in me that he either missed or deliberately ignored. The breaking point came on Thursday evening when Colonel Chen arrived at our house for what he had arranged as a family consultation about my upcoming training. I had suggested this meeting knowing it would force my father into direct conversation with someone whose military credentials far exceeded his own, creating a situation where his usual dismissive tactics would be impossible to employ. Colonel Chen's presence transformed our modest living room into something resembling a formal military briefing. He arrived in his dress uniform, wearing ribbons that told the story of 3 combat deployments, multiple commendations for valor, and leadership positions that my father had never approached during his own service. The visual contrast was stark and intentional. Here was what true military excellence looked like, and he was here to discuss my potential. "Staff Sergeant Reeves," Colonel Chen began, his tone respectful, but carrying the unmistakable authority of superior rank. "I wanted to personally thank you for raising a daughter with such exceptional leadership potential. Alexandra's preparation for OCS has been the most thorough I've encountered in 15 years of mentoring military candidates." My father sat rigidly on the edge of his chair, clearly uncomfortable with being addressed by his old rank while facing someone who had achieved the career success that had eluded him. "Colonel, I have to admit I'm surprised by all this. Alex never mentioned her interest in military service." "Perhaps you weren't listening," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "I mentioned West Point when I was 16. You laughed and told me the military wasn't for soft little girls who break a nail." The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Chen's expression remained neutral, but I could see him processing this information and drawing his own conclusions about the family dynamics that had shaped my motivation.
"I see," Colonel Chen said finally. "Well, regardless of past communications, Alexandra has demonstrated remarkable aptitude for military leadership. General Hutchinson specifically mentioned that her psychological evaluation showed exceptional resilience and decision-making ability under pressure. These aren't qualities that develop overnight." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder containing my complete preparation portfolio. "Staff Sergeant, I'd like you to review Alexandra's training records, fitness assessments, and leadership evaluations. I think you'll find them illuminating. My father accepted the folder with obvious reluctance, but military protocol demanded that he examine materials presented by a superior officer. As he read through page after page of documentation showing my systematic preparation and consistently exceptional performance, I watched his face cycle through confusion, surprise, and finally something approaching shock. The fitness scores alone told a story that contradicted everything he had believed about my physical capabilities. I was performing at levels that exceeded many active-duty soldiers, having transformed my body through the same discipline train that military athletes use to prepare for elite special operations selection. The leadership assessments from Dr. Kellerman's graduate-level simulations showed me consistently outperforming candidates with prior military experience. But perhaps most damaging to his assumptions were the letters of recommendation from Colonel Chen, Lieutenant Santos, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez. These weren't perfunctory endorsements, but detailed analyses of my character, capabilities, and potential that painted a picture of someone destined for significant military achievement. "This is comprehensive," my father said slowly, clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence before him with his long-held beliefs about my limitations. "But I still don't understand how you developed these capabilities without anyone noticing." "People noticed. You just weren't paying attention to anyone whose opinion might challenge your assumptions about me." Colonel Chen intervened before the conversation could become more personal. "Staff Sergeant, I've been mentoring military candidates for over a decade. I can usually predict within the first meeting whether someone has the potential for military leadership. Alexandra demonstrated that potential so clearly that I immediately began preparing her for advanced opportunities that most candidates never receive." He leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more direct. "What concerns me is that someone with her obvious capabilities apparently received no encouragement or support from her family during her preparation. In my experience, the most successful officers come from families that recognize and nurture their potential from an early age." This was the moment I had been building toward, when my father would be forced to confront his own role in failing to recognize or support my abilities. The criticism wasn't coming from me, which he could have dismissed as teenage resentment, but from a decorated military officer whose judgment he couldn't question without undermining his own respect for military hierarchy. My father's response revealed the depth of his psychological investment in maintaining his image as the sole source of military wisdom. "Colonel, I was trying to protect her from disappointment. The military can be harsh on people who aren't prepared for its demands. I've seen too many young people wash out because they overestimated their capabilities. And I've seen too many potential leaders never reach their full potential because authority figures underestimated their capabilities," Colonel Chen replied with quiet firmness. "Alexandra didn't just meet military standards, she exceeded them by margins that indicate exceptional natural ability combined with extraordinary dedication." He stood and gathered his materials, having accomplished exactly what I had hoped he would. "Staff Sergeant, I suggest you reconsider your assessment of your daughter's potential. In 3 months, she'll be graduating from OCS as one of the Army's newest officers. In 5 years, if her current trajectory continues, she'll likely outrank every veteran in this community, including myself when I was on active duty." The room fell silent as the implications of Colonel Chen's predictions settled over us. My father had spent years defining himself as the local military authority, the veteran whose opinion carried weight in discussions about service and sacrifice. Now he was being told that his daughter would soon surpass not just his own achievements, but those of everyone he had served alongside. After Colonel Chen departed, my father and I sat alone in the living room that had witnessed so many of his dismissive comments about my potential. The contrast between those memories and our current reality was so stark that neither of us seemed to know how to bridge the gap. "Why didn't you tell me you were serious about this?" he asked finally, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Because you made it clear that my opinions about my own capabilities weren't worth considering. You had already decided what I was capable of achieving, and nothing I said was going to change that assessment." He stared at the folder containing documentation of my preparation, as if it would somehow explain how he had been so wrong about his own daughter.
I thought I was being realistic about your limitations.
You were being realistic about your own limitations and projecting them onto me, I said, finally speaking the truth I had been carrying for months. You couldn't imagine me succeeding in areas where you had fallen short, so you convinced yourself that I was incapable of even trying. The words hung between us like a bridge we would either cross together or watch burn. For 22 years, our relationship had been built on his authority and my deference. Now, for the first time, we were meeting as equals, with my achievements providing credentials that he could no longer dismiss or diminish. "What happens now?" he asked, and for the first time in my memory, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves was asking his daughter for guidance, rather than offering it. "Now you decide whether you want to be proud of what I've accomplished or spend the rest of your life explaining to people why you never saw it coming. Because in January, I'm leaving for Fort Benning. In April, I'll graduate as Second Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves, and after that, my success or failure will have nothing to do with whether you believe I'm capable of achieving it." I stood and walked toward the stairs, leaving him alone with the evidence of how completely he had misjudged the daughter he thought he knew so well. The confrontation was over, the power dynamic permanently altered, and my transformation from his worthless disappointment to someone he would have to respect was now irreversible. The fallout from my confrontation with my father rippled through our family and community in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, creating new challenges that tested my resolve and forced me to navigate consequences I had prepared for intellectually, but was now experiencing emotionally. The month following Colonel Chen's visit became a complex nous of relationships shifting, expectations adjusting, and my father attempting various strategies to regain some semblance of control over a situation that had completely escaped his influence. My mother, who had remained largely silent during years of my father's dismissive comments about my capabilities, suddenly found herself caught between her husband's wounded pride and her daughter's undeniable achievements. Linda Reeves had spent 25 years supporting my father's version of family dynamics, where his military experience made him the unquestioned authority on matters of strength, capability, and potential. Now, she was watching that authority crumble in real time, and her response revealed complexities in our family structure that I hadn't fully understood. "Alex, you could have handled this differently," she said during a tense conversation in our kitchen 3 days after the Colonel Chen meeting. "Your father is trying to process all of this, and publicly embarrassing him doesn't help anyone." Her words stung because they revealed that even now, even with overwhelming evidence of my capabilities and my father's misjudgment, she was more concerned about protecting his ego than acknowledging my achievements. The pattern of making his comfort the family's primary consideration remained intact despite everything that had changed. "Mom, I didn't embarrass him," I replied, keeping my voice level despite my frustration. "His own assumptions embarrassed him. I simply stopped hiding my capabilities to make those assumptions seem accurate." She looked uncomfortable with this characterization, fidgeting with her coffee cup as she searched for a response that would somehow restore the family equilibrium she was accustomed to maintaining. "He's your father, Alexandra. He was trying to protect you from disappointment." "He was protecting himself from being overshadowed," I corrected gently but firmly. There's a difference between protective guidance and systematically undermining someone's confidence in their own abilities. This conversation marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the next several weeks. Family members, neighbors, and community acquaintances all struggled to reconcile their previous perceptions of our family dynamics with the new reality of my military appointment and my father's obvious shock at my achievements. Some people,
particularly older veterans who remembered my father's service fondly, tried to reframe the situation in ways that preserved his reputation while accommodating my success. "Danny always knew Alex had potential" became a common refrain, despite overwhelming evidence that he had consistently expressed the opposite view. He just wanted her to be sure she was ready for military challenges. Other people, particularly women who had witnessed his dismissive comments about my capabilities over the years, were less charitable in their reassessment. Margaret Patterson, Mike's wife, who had been present during several of my father's more cruel observations about my limitations, made a point of congratulating me publicly, while pointedly noting that some people are better at recognizing potential than others. But perhaps the most challenging response came from my father himself, who cycled through various strategies for regaining psychological equilibrium in a situation where his fundamental assumptions about his daughter had been proven spectacularly wrong. His first approach was historical revisionism, attempting to recast his previous dismissals as strategic motivation designed to push me towards excellence. During a family dinner the week after my confrontation, he announced to my visiting aunt and uncle that he had always known Alex had military potential and had used reverse psychology to motivate her to prove herself. "Is that what you call telling me I wasn't built for anything requiring real strength or courage? Reverse psychology?" I asked, not allowing this revisionist narrative to go unchallenged.
The uncomfortable silence that followed made it clear that no one at the table believed his reframing, but it also established that he wasn't going to simply accept responsibility for his misjudgment without attempting to save face through creative reinterpretation of events. His second strategy involved attempting to insert himself into my military preparation and future career in ways that would allow him to claim some credit for my eventual success. He began researching my OCS program and the 82nd Airborne Division, sharing information I already knew as if he were providing valuable guidance I couldn't have obtained myself. "Fort Benning has some of the toughest training in the Army," he informed me one evening, as if I hadn't spent months researching every aspect of the program. "You'll need to be prepared for instructors who won't give you any special treatment because you're female." "Dad, I've been training with Master Sergeant Rodriguez specifically for those challenges," I replied patiently. "My fitness scores already exceed the male standards, and my mental preparation has been designed around the expectation of proving myself to skeptical instructors." He looked frustrated by my comprehensive preparation, clearly hoping to find areas where his guidance would be needed and valued. The reality that I had systematically addressed every aspect of military readiness without his input was another blow to his sense of relevance in my development. His third and most troubling strategy involved attempting to undermine my confidence through subtle expressions of doubt disguised as concern. "I hope you're prepared for the possibility that OCS might be different from your training simulations," he would say, or "real military pressure is different from anything you can practice in civilian settings." These comments were carefully calibrated to appear supportive while planting seeds of uncertainty about my readiness. After months of building unshakable confidence in my abilities, I found these paternal expressions of doubt particularly insidious because they targeted the one area where I remained vulnerable, my desire for his approval and support despite everything that had happened between us. Captain Hayes, during one of our continued morning runs, helped me recognize this pattern and develop strategies for managing it. "He's trying to regain psychological control by making you doubt yourself," she observed after I described his recent comments. "It's a common response when someone's authority has been challenged by evidence they can't refute." Her insight was both illuminating and disturbing. Even after being confronted with overwhelming evidence of my capabilities, my father was still trying to maintain his position as the authority on my potential by undermining the confidence I had worked so hard to develop. The key is recognizing that his doubts aren't based on accurate assessment of your readiness,
They're based on his psychological need to be right about something, even if it means hoping you'll struggle so he can say he warned you. This realization fundamentally changed how I interpreted his comments and prepared me for the ongoing challenge of maintaining my confidence while living in an environment where someone I loved was actively hoping I would fail to validate his predictions. The community response to my military appointment also created unexpected social pressures. Suddenly, I was being held up as an example for other young women in Millbrook, with parents encouraging their daughters to be like Alex Reeves, without understanding the years of systematic preparation that had made my success possible. Local newspaper coverage of my OCS appointment portrayed me as a hometown success story, but also created expectations that my eventual military career would somehow reflect positively on the entire community. People who had never shown interest in my achievements before were now claiming to have always known I was destined for success, creating a revisionist narrative that minimized the significance of my father's failure to recognize my potential. The weight of these expectations, combined with my father's ongoing attempts to undermine my confidence, created a psychological pressure I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer just pursuing military service to prove my capabilities. I was carrying the hopes of people who saw me as validation for their own daughter's potential, while managing a family dynamic that remained fundamentally unchanged, despite evidence that should have transformed it. As Christmas approached and my January departure for Fort Benning drew nearer, I realized that proving my father wrong had been the easy part. The harder challenge would be maintaining my sense of purpose and identity while navigating the complex web of relationships and expectations that my success had created. The girl who had once sought only her father's approval was about to leave for military training carrying the expectations of an entire community, the subtle sabotage of a parent who couldn't accept being wrong, and the responsibility of proving that women could excel in military leadership without compromising their authentic selves. But I was no longer the uncertain young woman who had absorbed her father's limitations as her own. I was someone who had built unshakable confidence through systematic preparation, who had earned the respect of decorated military professionals, and who understood that external validation, whether positive or negative, could not define my worth or potential.
January at Fort Benning marked the beginning of the most intense 12 weeks of my life, where every prediction my father had made about my inability to handle military pressure would be tested in the crucible of accelerated officer candidate school. The battles I fought there weren't just against the legendary rigors of Army training, but against the echoes of his voice telling me I wasn't built for leadership, wasn't strong enough for real challenges, and would inevitably wash out when faced with authentic military demands. The accelerated OCS program accepted only 10 candidates nationwide, individuals whose preparation and potential indicated they could handle compressed training without compromising standards. From the moment I stepped off the bus at Fort Benning, I was surrounded by candidates who had distinguished themselves through prior enlisted service, military academy preparation, or exceptional civilian achievements that translated directly to military leadership. My fellow candidates included Marcus Williams, a former Marine sergeant who had earned a Bronze Star in Afghanistan before pursuing his commission; Jennifer Chang, a West Point dropout who had left the academy for family reasons but maintained military fitness standards while completing her degree; and David Torres, whose father was a retired command sergeant major and who had grown up immersed in military culture in ways I could never match. The immediate challenge wasn't just proving I belonged among these exceptional candidates, but doing so while carrying psychological baggage that none of them seemed to share. While they approached training with confidence born from years of validation and support, I was fighting against internalized doubts that my father had spent decades cultivating. The first test came during initial physical fitness assessments, where candidates were evaluated not just on meeting standards, but on demonstrating the superior conditioning expected of future officers in elite units.
Master Sergeant Rodriguez's training had prepared me well, but executing under the scrutiny of Drill Sergeant Thompson, a 20-year veteran whose reputation for breaking overconfident candidates was legendary, required mental toughness that went beyond physical preparation. "Candidate Reeves," Drill Sergeant Thompson announced after reviewing my scores. "Outstanding performance on all events. You've set the standard for your class." His approval was matter-of-fact, professional recognition of measurable achievement, but it represented the first time a military authority figure had acknowledged my capabilities without surprise or qualification. The validation was profound, not because I needed external approval, but because it confirmed that my preparation had been effective, and my father's predictions about my inability to meet military standards were demonstrably false. Every mile I ran, every obstacle I navigated, every physical challenge I exceeded was evidence that contradicted his assessment of my limitations. But the physical demands of OCS, rigorous as they were, proved less challenging than the psychological pressure of leadership scenarios designed to reveal character under stress. These exercises placed candidates in simulated combat situations where they had to make decisions with incomplete information, manage conflicting personalities, and maintain unit effectiveness while facing cascading crises that tested every aspect of their judgment and composure. During the third week of training, I faced my most challenging leadership scenario yet. Our squad was tasked with evacuating simulated casualties through hostile territory while managing limited resources and competing priorities. As the designated leader for this exercise, I had to coordinate medical care, tactical movement, and communication with higher command, while several team members actively challenged my authority in ways designed to test my confidence and decision-making under pressure. "Candidate Reeves, your casualty evacuation plan is too cautious," announced Candidate Williams, a former Marine whose combat experience gave weight to his criticism. "Real soldiers don't have time for consensus building when people are dying." His challenge was carefully crafted to exploit potential insecurities about my leadership style, attempting to force me into either defensive justification or authoritarian overcorrection. Either response would have demonstrated the kind of uncertainty that military leaders cannot afford when lives depend on their decisions. Instead, I maintained calm authority while acknowledging his perspective and explaining my reasoning. "Candidate Williams, your combat experience is valuable input that I have incorporated into this plan. However, the tactical situation requires balancing speed with security, and my assessment is that rushing the evacuation without proper reconnaissance increases casualty risk beyond acceptable levels." I continued coordinating the evacuation without defensiveness or aggression, demonstrating the kind of collaborative but decisive leadership that Colonel Chen had helped me develop. When the exercise concluded, our squad had successfully completed the mission with all casualties evacuated and no additional losses, a result that only 3 of the 10 candidates achieved during their leadership rotations. Drill Sergeant Thompson's after-action review was characteristically blunt. Candidate Reeves demonstrated superior situational awareness, effective resource management, and the ability to maintain unit cohesion under pressure. His leadership style builds consensus without compromising decisiveness, exactly what we expect from officers destined for command positions. The feedback was professionally delivered, but its personal significance was enormous. Everything my father had criticized about my approach to leadership, my tendency to listen before speaking, my preference for building agreement rather than demanding compliance, and my calm demeanor under pressure, was being validated as exactly the kind of leadership the modern army needed.
Week by week, exercise by exercise, I was accumulating evidence that contradicted every limitation my father had tried to impose on my potential. The girl he had claimed would break down crying when faced with real pressure was excelling in scenarios designed to identify future combat leaders. The daughter he had insisted lacked the mental toughness for military service was earning recognition from instructors whose opinion carried real weight in determining military careers. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from my fellow candidates, whose respect I earned through consistent performance rather than gender-based accommodation. By the 6th week of training, they were seeking my input on tactical problems, deferring to my judgment in leadership rotations, and acknowledging my capabilities in ways that had nothing to do with political correctness or social experimentation. Reeves, how did you stay so calm during the night navigation exercise? Candidate Chang asked after a particularly challenging field training event. Half the class was losing their minds trying to coordinate movement in zero visibility, but you just methodically worked through the problem like it was a routine training scenario. Her question revealed something I was beginning to understand about my own leadership capabilities. The traits my father had criticized as weaknesses, my analytical approach to problems, my emotional stability under pressure, my preference for systematic planning over reactive decision-making, were actually strengths that distinguished me from candidates who relied more on aggression or charisma than strategic thinking. The transformation wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. With each successful exercise, each piece of positive feedback, each demonstration of competence under pressure, I was shedding layers of self-doubt that had accumulated through years of paternal criticism. I was discovering who Alexandra Reeves actually was when freed from the constraints of others' limited expectations. Letters from home during this period revealed the ongoing struggle my family was having with accepting my success. My mother's updates were carefully neutral, sharing news about community events and family activities, while avoiding any mention of my military training or achievements. My father's single letter was a masterpiece of subtle undermining disguised as paternal concern. "I hope you're finding OCS as challenging as you expected," he wrote. "Remember that there's no shame in discovering that military life isn't what you anticipated. Your family will support whatever decision you make about your future, including if you decide that officer training isn't the right path for you." The letter was carefully crafted to appear supportive while planting seeds of doubt about my commitment and hinting that failure would be understandable and acceptable. Reading it in my barracks after another day of exceeding training standards and earning instructor recognition, I realized how thoroughly his influence had been neutralized by the evidence of my own capabilities. Instead of undermining my confidence, his doubts now seemed irrelevant and almost pitiable. He was still operating from assumptions about my limitations that had been systematically disproven by my performance in the most demanding training environment the Army offered. His opinion about my potential had been superseded by objective evidence that no amount of psychological manipulation could counter. As I prepared for the final phase of OCS training, I carried with me the accumulated proof that everything my father had said about my limitations was wrong. Not just mistaken, but so fundamentally incorrect that it revealed more about his own psychological needs than about my actual capabilities. The battles ahead would determine whether I graduated as Second Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves and earned assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division. But the most important battle, the one for my own sense of worth and potential, had already been won through systematic excellence that made my father's doubts seem like echoes from someone else's life. In 3 weeks, I would either validate Brigadier General Hutchinson's confidence in my potential or prove that accelerated OCS had been a mistake. But regardless of the outcome, I would face that test as someone who finally knew her own strength, unencumbered by anyone else's limitations or fears about what she might achieve. The resolution of my primary conflict with my father's expectations came not through a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulating weight of achievements that made his original assessment of my limitations impossible to maintain. By the final week of officer candidate school, I had systematically dismantled every prediction he had made about my inability to succeed in military leadership, creating a new reality that would force him to completely reconstruct his understanding of who his daughter actually was.
The culmination arrived during OCS graduation week, when Brigadier General Patricia Hutchinson personally presented me with the Distinguished Leadership Award, recognizing the candidate who had demonstrated exceptional command potential throughout the accelerated program. Standing in formation as she announced my name, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity about how far I had traveled from the girl my father had dismissed as worthless just months earlier. Second Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves, General Hutchinson announced to the assembled graduates and their families, has demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and decisive leadership that represents the future of Army Officer Corps. Her performance throughout OCS has been consistently exceptional, and her assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division reflects our confidence in her potential for rapid advancement.
The ceremony was being live-streamed for families who couldn't attend, which meant my parents were watching from Millbrook as their daughter received recognition that exceeded anything my father had achieved during his entire military career. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was witnessing my triumph from the same living room where he had declared me unfit for military service. But the most meaningful moment came when General Hutchinson pulled me aside after the ceremony for a private conversation that would reshape my entire career trajectory. "Lieutenant Reeves," she began, "I've been following your progress through OCS with particular interest. Your instructors have consistently reported that you demonstrate leadership capabilities typically seen in officers with years of experience. Colonel Chen's initial assessment of your potential appears to have been conservative." She paused, studying me with the kind of evaluative gaze that senior officers use when making decisions that will impact careers and lives. "I'm offering you an opportunity that doesn't come along often. The 82nd Airborne is about to launch a pilot program for accelerated leadership development designed to fast-track exceptional officers into command positions. If you accept, you'll spend 6 months in an intensive training program that could position you for company command within 3 years instead of the typical 5 to 7 years. The offer was extraordinary, representing the kind of career acceleration that most officers could only dream about. It would mean bypassing traditional timelines and proving myself in leadership roles that my father had insisted I was fundamentally incapable of handling. "General, I'm honored by this opportunity," I replied, maintaining the professional composure that had become second nature during OCS training. "Could you tell me more about the specific requirements and expectations for this program?" Her smile suggested that my question demonstrated exactly the kind of thoughtful approach she was looking for. "The program requires participants to take on progressively challenging leadership assignments while being closely mentored by senior officers. It's designed for lieutenants who show potential for strategic command roles, not just tactical competence. The failure rate is approximately 30%, but graduates typically advance to field-grade officer positions faster than any other career path." I accepted without hesitation, knowing that this opportunity would validate my capabilities in ways that would make my father's original dismissals seem not just wrong, but absurdly so. Within months of him declaring me unfit for military service, I would be participating in elite leadership development reserved for officers identified as having exceptional potential. The ceremony concluded with personal congratulations from instructors who had pushed me through 12 weeks of the most demanding training the Army offered. Drill Sergeant Thompson, whose approval I had earned through consistent excellence rather than gender-based accommodation, offered a handshake and words that carried particular weight given his reputation for brutal honesty about candidate capabilities. "Lieutenant Reeves, in 20 years of training officers, I've rarely seen someone adapt to military leadership as naturally as you have," he said. "Your father should be proud of raising someone with your character and capabilities." His comment was professionally delivered, but I recognized the subtle message. The instructors had clearly discussed my family situation and understood that my motivation included proving critics wrong. His acknowledgement that my father should be proud was both validation of my achievements and gentle criticism of the lack of family support that had characterized my journey. 3 days after graduation, I received a phone call that completed my vindication in the most dramatic way possible. My father's former commanding officer, General Harrison, was calling not to speak with my father about military matters, but to congratulate me directly on achievements that had come to his attention through Army leadership channels.
Lieutenant Reeves, General Harrison began, I wanted to personally congratulate you on your OCS performance and selection for accelerated leadership development. Word travels fast in the Army when someone demonstrates exceptional potential, and your name is being mentioned in conversations about the future of military leadership. He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I believe your father has some idea of your recent achievements, but I thought you should know that your reputation is already being established at levels of command that most new lieutenants never reach. You've made quite an impression on people whose opinions carry significant weight in determining military careers. The conversation was professional and encouraging, but its real significance lay in what it revealed about my changing status within the military community my father most respected. I was no longer his daughter who had somehow managed to graduate from OCS. I was Second Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves, recognized by senior leadership as an officer with exceptional potential for advancement. When I called home that evening to share news of my assignment to the Accelerated Leadership Program, my father answered the phone with a tone I had never heard before, uncertainty mixed with something approaching respect. "Alex," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "congratulations on your graduation. I saw the ceremony online and, well, I have to admit, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished."
The admission was grudging and incomplete, but it represented the first time he had directly acknowledged that his assessment of my capabilities had been incorrect. More importantly, his tone suggested that he understood the magnitude of his miscalculation and was struggling to reconcile his long-held beliefs with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "Thank you, Dad," I replied, keeping my response gracious rather than triumphant. "I know this wasn't what you expected when I first mentioned military service." "No," he said quietly, "it wasn't. I was wrong about what you were capable of achieving. I'm still trying to understand how I missed it." This conversation marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. For the first time in my life, my father was speaking to me as someone whose achievements commanded respect, rather than someone whose aspirations needed to be managed or contained. The power imbalance that had defined our interactions for 22 years had been permanently altered by evidence he could neither dismiss nor explain away. The transformation was complete when he asked a question that revealed how thoroughly his assumptions about my potential had been shattered. "What should I tell people when they ask about your military career? I want to make sure I represent your achievements accurately." For decades, my father had been the family authority on military matters, the veteran whose opinion carried weight in discussions about service and sacrifice. Now, he was asking his daughter, the one he had called worthless, to guide him in understanding achievements that exceeded his own military experience. "Tell them I'm serving as an officer in the 82nd Airborne Division and working to become the kind of leader the Army needs. Tell them I'm proud to follow in the tradition of family military service while building my own career path." The conversation ended with something neither of us had experienced before: mutual respect based on accurate assessment of each other's capabilities and achievements. I was no longer the daughter seeking his approval. I was a military officer whose success had forced him to confront his own limitations in recognizing potential. The Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves would have to live with the knowledge that he had completely misjudged his daughter's potential, while Second Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves could move forward in her military career knowing that she had proven herself to the only critic whose opinion had ever truly mattered to her. The girl he had called worthless was now an officer recognized by Army leadership as having exceptional potential for advancement. The daughter he had claimed would never earn respect from real soldiers was participating in elite leadership development reserved for future commanders. The conflict was over, the victory complete, and the transformation irreversible. The 18 months following my OCS graduation marked a period of professional renaissance that exceeded even my most optimistic projections when I first decided to pursue military service.
The Accelerated Leadership Development Program at Fort Bragg became the laboratory where I transformed from a newly commissioned officer proving her worth into a recognized military leader whose capabilities were being noticed at the highest levels of Army command. My assignment to Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division, placed me under the mentorship of Major Catherine Walsh, a combat veteran whose own rapid advancement through the ranks had established her as one of the Army's most promising female leaders. Major Walsh had specifically requested me for her company after reviewing my OCS performance records and speaking with Brigadier General Hutchinson about the Accelerated Leadership Development Program's objectives. Lieutenant Reeves, you've been selected for this program because senior leadership believes you have the potential for strategic command roles within the next decade. My job is to accelerate your development through challenging assignments that would typically take years to access. The responsibilities she outlined were both thrilling and daunting. Instead of the standard platoon leader assignment given to new lieutenants, I would rotate through multiple leadership positions within the battalion, gaining experience in logistics, operations, intelligence, and personnel management. Each rotation would be evaluated not just for competence, but for the kind of innovative thinking and strategic perspective that distinguished future commanders from capable tactical officers. My first assignment was leading the company's logistics operations during a major training exercise involving 3 battalions and over 2,000 soldiers. The complexity of coordinating supply lines, transportation, medical support, and communications for an operation of this scale was designed to test my ability to think systematically while managing multiple variables under pressure. The exercise began with a simulated airborne insertion into hostile territory, followed by 72 hours of continuous operations, where my logistics planning would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed due to supply shortages, equipment failures, or communication breakdowns. Everything I had learned about strategic thinking during my months of preparation would be tested in real-time scenarios where mistakes had immediate consequences for mission success.
The first crisis occurred 18 hours into the exercise, when a simulated enemy attack destroyed one of our primary supply depots, forcing me to reorganize the entire logistics network while maintaining operational support for units already engaged in combat scenarios. The solution required relocating supply caches, rerouting transportation, and coordinating with aviation assets to establish alternative resupply methods, all while maintaining the communication flow that kept battalion commanders informed of resource availability. Lieutenant Reeves, your logistics network is still functioning at full capacity despite losing 30% of your initial supply infrastructure, Major Walsh observed during a mid-exercise briefing. How did you maintain operational effectiveness while adapting to such significant disruption? My response drew on months of studying military history and strategic planning principles. Ma'am, I built redundancy into the initial plan, specifically anticipating that enemy action would target our logistics capabilities. The key was designing a system that could function at reduced capacity without compromising mission-critical operations. Her approval was evident, but more importantly, I could see that my approach had impressed the battalion commander and senior staff officers who were evaluating exercise performance. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the battalion commander, made a point of complimenting my logistics management during the after-action review. Lieutenant Reeves demonstrated the kind of strategic foresight and adaptive thinking that separates exceptional officers from merely competent ones. His logistics planning enabled this battalion to maintain operational tempo despite significant challenges that would have degraded effectiveness under conventional supply management. This recognition established my reputation within the 82nd Airborne as an officer whose capabilities exceeded normal expectations for someone with my limited experience. Word of my performance began circulating through military networks in ways that would have been impossible for my father to ignore, even if he had wanted to minimize my achievements. The validation became undeniable when I received my first efficiency report as a platoon leader 6 months into my assignment at Fort Bragg.
Major Walsh's evaluation placed me in the top 1% of officers at my rank and experience level, with comments that explicitly identified me as having potential for accelerated promotion and command responsibilities. Lieutenant Reeves consistently demonstrates mature judgment, innovative problem-solving, and natural leadership ability that suggests she is ready for responsibilities typically assigned to more experienced officers, her report stated. She has earned the respect and confidence of both subordinates and superiors through consistent excellence in challenging assignments. Recommend for accelerated promotion consideration and advanced leadership development opportunities. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers I led, whose respect had to be earned through competence and character rather than rank or authority. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, a 15-year veteran who had served multiple combat deployments, offered feedback that validated my leadership approach in ways that transcended official evaluations. Ma'am, I've served under a lot of officers, and most new lieutenants spend their first year trying to prove they deserve the rank. You never seemed to doubt you belonged here, which made it easy for us to follow your lead. That's rare for someone so new to the Army. His observation revealed something important about my transformation. The confidence I had built through systematic preparation and proven performance had eliminated the insecurity that typically characterized new officers who were still establishing their authority. I wasn't leading from a position of proving myself worthy. I was leading from a position of knowing my own capabilities and expecting others to recognize them. The contrast with my father's predictions about my inability to earn respect from real soldiers was stark and undeniable. Not only was I commanding the respect of experienced combat veterans, but they were seeking my leadership in situations where their safety and mission success depended on my judgment and competence. News of my military success filtered back to Millbrook through various channels, creating a completely different narrative about the Reeves family than had existed when I first announced my intention to join the Army. Instead of being known as the veteran whose daughter had surprised everyone by joining the military, my father was increasingly being introduced as the father of Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves, the young officer who was making a name for herself in the 82nd Airborne. The shift in community perception became evident during my first visit home since OCS graduation. People who had previously paid little attention to my achievements were now approaching me with genuine interest in my military career and asking detailed questions about my responsibilities and future plans. Mrs. Henderson, whose son had struggled through basic training and been assigned to a support unit, stopped me outside the grocery store to express amazement at my rapid advancement. "Alex, we're hearing you're already being considered for promotion? That's incredible for someone who's been in the Army less than 2 years." Her comment reflected a broader change in how my military service was being perceived. I was no longer the local girl who had surprised people by joining the Army. I was a rising military leader whose achievements were bringing recognition to our community. More significantly, my father's role in these conversations had fundamentally changed. Instead of being the local military authority whose opinions were sought on questions about service and leadership, he was increasingly being asked about my daughter's career in ways that positioned me as the family's primary military achievement.
"Danny, you must be proud of Alex's success in the Army," became a common refrain from people who remembered his initial skepticism about my military potential. "She's really making a name for herself." These interactions forced him to publicly acknowledge my achievements, while privately grappling with the magnitude of his misjudgment about my capabilities. The daughter he had dismissed as worthless was being celebrated by the very community whose respect he valued most. During my week-long leave in Millbrook, I observed how completely our family dynamic had shifted. My father no longer spoke to me with the patronizing tone that had characterized our relationship for 2 decades. Instead, he asked careful questions about my responsibilities and career trajectory, seeking to understand rather than critique or minimize my experiences. "What kind of soldiers are you leading now?" he asked during a quiet conversation on our back porch, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Experienced paratroopers, mostly.
Many of them have multiple combat deployments and more years in service than I have. Leading them requires earning their respect through competence rather than relying on rank alone. His expression suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what I had achieved. The daughter he had claimed would never earn respect from real soldiers was successfully leading some of the Army's most experienced and demanding troops. The transformation was complete when he made an observation that revealed how thoroughly his perspective had changed. I'm starting to understand why General Harrison was so impressed when he called to congratulate you. What you've accomplished isn't just about joining the military, it's about excelling at a level that most people never reach. For the first time in my life, my father was speaking about my achievements with genuine pride rather than surprised acknowledgement. The girl he had called worthless had become someone whose success exceeded his own military accomplishments in ways that commanded his respect and admiration. The Renaissance wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. I had discovered who Alexandra Reeves actually was when freed from the constraints of others' limited expectations. And that person was capable of achievements that surpassed even my own ambitious projections when I first decided to prove my father wrong. 2 years after that midnight phone call from General Harrison, I stood in my office at Fort Meridian as the newly promoted Colonel Alexandra Reeves, preparing for my assignment to the Pentagon Strategic Command, the youngest officer to hold such a position in the past decade. The journey from my father's worthless disappointment to one of the Army's most promising strategic leaders had been completed not through a single dramatic achievement, but through the steady accumulation of excellence that made my potential impossible to ignore. The promotion ceremony the previous week had been attended by dignitaries whose presence reflected the significance the Army placed on my advancement. Brigadier General Hutchinson, now promoted to Major General, had personally conducted the ceremony, noting in her remarks that my career trajectory represented the future of military leadership in an increasingly complex global environment. Colonel Reeves embodies the kind of strategic thinking, adaptive leadership, and innovative problem-solving that our nation requires from its military commanders. Her rapid advancement is not the result of favoritism or social experimentation, but of consistently exceptional performance that has distinguished her at every level of responsibility. The validation was professionally satisfying, but the personal significance was even greater. Sitting in the audience, my father had watched his daughter receive recognition that exceeded his highest military aspirations, finally understanding the full magnitude of his misjudgment about my potential. Now, as I reviewed briefing materials for my first Pentagon assignment, I reflected on how completely my life had diverged from the path my father had envisioned for me. Instead of the retail career or elementary teaching position he had predicted, I was preparing to influence national defense strategy at the highest levels of government. The girl he had claimed would never earn respect from real soldiers was about to work alongside the most senior military leaders in the country. My phone rang, interrupting these reflections. The caller ID showed my parents' home number, and I answered expecting my mother's voice with updates about community events and family news. Instead, my father's voice came through the line, carrying a tone I had never heard before. Genuine pride mixed with something approaching awe. "Alex, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he began, his voice uncertain in the way that had become characteristic since my military success began exceeding his comprehension. "Never too busy to talk with you, Dad," I replied, settling back in my chair. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined when I first announced my intention to join the Army. Gone were the patronizing lectures and dismissive comments, replaced by conversations where he sought my perspective on current events and military affairs rather than offering unwanted guidance. "I wanted to tell you about something that happened at the VFW tonight. Colonel Morrison was visiting from Fort Campbell, and when he heard my name, he asked if you were related to Colonel Alexandra Reeves from the 82nd Airborne. When I told him you were my daughter, he spent 20 minutes telling everyone in the hall about your reputation in military circles."
I could hear the wonder in his voice as he described the conversation. "Alex," he said, "your name comes up in discussions about future Army leadership, that senior commanders consider you one of the most promising officers of your generation. He told me that your work on logistics innovation has been studied at the War College and that your strategic planning contributions have influenced Army doctrine." The recognition Colonel Morrison described was accurate,
but represented only a fraction of what my career had become. During my time with the 82nd Airborne, I had developed new approaches to rapid deployment logistics that had been adopted Army-wide. My analysis of emerging security threats had been cited in congressional briefings on defense modernization. My leadership during joint exercises with international forces had earned commendations from foreign military commanders who rarely praised American officers with my limited experience. "Dad, I'm grateful for Colonel Morrison's kind words," I replied, though I could sense there was more he wanted to say. "There's something else," he continued, his voice growing quieter. "After everyone left, I sat in my truck in the VFW parking lot for an hour, thinking about what he had said. Alex, I spent your entire childhood telling you what you couldn't achieve, what you weren't capable of, what limitations you needed to accept, and you've exceeded every one of my accomplishments while serving at levels I never even aspired to reach." This was the conversation I had been unconsciously waiting for since that night when he had dismissed my military ambitions as impossible dreams. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement of how fundamentally wrong he had been about his daughter's potential. "I need you to know that my failure to recognize your capabilities wasn't about you. It was about my own fears, my own limitations, my own inability to imagine that someone I had raised could achieve things I had never accomplished. I projected my own ceiling onto you instead of recognizing that you had no ceiling at all." His words carried a weight of understanding that had taken years to develop. This wasn't the defensive rationalization he had attempted immediately after my OCS graduation, but genuine insight into how his own psychological needs had blinded him to my actual potential. "Dad, I understand why you responded the way you did. Military service was your identity, your source of pride, and the idea that your daughter might surpass your achievements threatened something fundamental about how you saw yourself." "But that's exactly what makes this so remarkable," he said, surprising me with his directness. "You didn't just surpass my achievements, you redefined what achievement looks like. You've become someone I couldn't have imagined because I was too limited in my thinking to recognize that kind of potential." We talked for another hour, covering everything from my upcoming Pentagon assignment to his own evolving understanding of what strength and leadership actually meant. For the first time in our relationship, we were speaking as equals, two adults with military experience discussing careers and futures, without the underlying tension that had characterized our interactions for decades. "One more thing," he said, as our conversation was ending. "When people ask me about my daughter now, I don't talk about how surprised I was by your success. I tell them about how proud I am of who you've become and what you've achieved, because the surprise was my failure, not your success." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office, processing the completeness of my transformation from the girl who had once sought his approval above all else to the woman who had earned his respect through achievements he couldn't have imagined possible. The journey had taught me that the most important battles are often fought within ourselves, against limitations we've internalized from others who projected their own fears onto our potential. My father's dismissive comments about my capabilities were intended to protect me from disappointment, but they had actually been protecting himself from the possibility that I might achieve things he had never accomplished. His identity was so tied to being the family's military authority that my success in that arena threatened something fundamental about how he saw himself. But perhaps the most valuable lesson was that external validation, even from the person whose approval I had most desperately wanted, was ultimately less important than the internal confidence that came from knowing my own capabilities. The girl who had changed the locks on our lake house was motivated by a desire to prove her father wrong. The colonel who now commanded respect from the highest levels of military leadership was motivated by a commitment to serve her country at the highest level of her abilities. Tomorrow, I would begin my assignment at the Pentagon,
working on strategic issues that would influence national security for years to come. The responsibilities were enormous, the expectations unprecedented for someone of my age and experience, and the opportunities for impact beyond anything I had imagined when I first decided to pursue military service.
But tonight, for the first time since that evening when my father had called me worthless, I experienced something I had never expected to feel: complete peace with our relationship. Not because he had finally validated my achievements, but because I no longer needed his validation to know who I was and what I was capable of becoming. The girl he had underestimated had become someone he now looked up to, and the father who had once dismissed her potential was finally proud to tell people that Colonel Alexandra Reeves was his daughter. The transformation was complete, the victory absolute, and the future unlimited. Some people spend their entire lives proving critics wrong. I had chosen to prove myself right, and that had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.